In the spring of 2009, some events came together in a ways that I could have never foreseen that forever changed and shaped my life. In that spring, I was recorded by a man having said that I wanted him to kill my wife. And he took that recording and he brought it to her, and the two of them then took the recording to the law enforcement. And the law enforcement took that to the FBI because the case involved two states at the time. Washington, or correction, I live in Washington now, but then I was living in Virginia, and she was in Louisiana. We had just sort of separated, and after they took that to the FBI, he came back to me wearing a wire that they asked him to wear, and recorded a conversation that then became a discovery video for my trial. And he, on that video, he was telling me that he had murdered her and how he had done it and what would be ultimately next for him and I. And that video is still available on YouTube, and you can watch it. It's kind of makes me cold and sad to think about that video still. And that video was obviously used against me, but in numerous ways. And one of them is just the fact that I showed so little emotion during that. During the video, I wasn't crushed. I didn't show how crushed I really was at that time. And that goes back to sort of just our survival instincts. They say that we're familiar with the fight or flight response, but the other one is freeze. And that's something that I often turn to when I'm overwhelmed by things and events in my life, or by an encounter with somebody, especially if I feel that they are, that they can cause physical damage to me or harm, or that I'm powerless against them. That I don't run and I don't fight, I just freeze. And so in this video, I've got a very plain face that seems to show that I don't care about the things that had just been told to me, how he had taken the life of this person. And at the time, I had no idea that what he was telling me was all lies. And I didn't have the opportunity to record then what I really felt, which was just the worst feelings that I've ever experienced in my life. Because at that time, I truly believed that I had taken the life of somebody that I had loved, and somebody who I intended to spend the rest of my life with at one time. And I'm not a person who can do that, to do those kinds of things. Many years later, when I was still incarcerated, I saw a quote that will stay with me forever, which simply says that which we can do and that which we can live with are not always the same thing. And I was experiencing that so dramatically in that time. It felt as if my spirit had been just torn open, and all of the good that I'd ever accumulated in my entire life had just spilled out of me. And I felt just grief and emptiness for her and for myself, because I learned that the actions that we take can't ever just affect another, but they affect us as well. And as much as I thought that I'd hurt her, I'd hurt myself greatly. I remember in those times, in the first few weeks after he had told me that, it wasn't really that long before the FBI came and picked me up. But I remember one time just trying to bring myself together for one more day and telling myself that, in a while I could get this behind me and that I could somehow move on with my life. But still knowing that I had had somebody murdered, and I was so wrong. I don't know how I would have been able to continue if that had ultimately been true. But I remember one day just simply laying on the earth, and a small drizzle was coming down. And I laid there and I just prayed. I prayed that something would come to me, that something would make me whole again, and that I would be all right. And I prayed that whatever I thought I'd done had not actually happened. And eventually my prayers were answered in a way that I didn't really expect, but it was a blessing. At first I was surprised to find in my mail it was the Sprint bill, right, for the telephones. And on it, which normally when we get the bill, you just get a bill and it says how much you need to pay them, and that's about it. Maybe a little bit about the data used, etc. But for reasons that I still don't know, it was an entire summary of all of the calls made for her line and my line. And I got it and started looking through it, and I saw that her phone was still active and she was still making calls, and that it was to people that she knew, her parents, friends, sister, and that gave me a great sense of relief because it showed that she was still alive. However, it left me hanging still in this in-between place, knowing that he said that he did something, that he had taken her life, but she was still alive. And so, of course, I got the sense that something was coming my way. And then, maybe it was a couple weeks later, I was staying with a woman and I got a knock on the door, and I answered the door, and it was a man who identified himself as being with the FBI, and he told me that I was under arrest. And in that moment, I felt relief, which was something that was surprising at the time. But then looking back on it, the relief was that the lie was over, and that I had an opportunity to face my mistakes rather than live with her death. And so they took me in, and I wrote a statement admitting my guilt, having known essentially at that time that they got me. They had me recorded. He told me about the video that had taken place on the same step that he had picked me up at. And so after our interview, he took me to a county jail in, it's the city in county jail in Virginia for Charlottesville and Albemarle County. And I stayed the night there. And I stayed in a holding cell that was essentially just it was cells on three sides and a desk in the middle for the COs, correctional officers. And I remember getting locked up in that cell. And strangely, I slept the best that I'd had that night. I woke up to a new day and a new life. And that was June 24th is when I woke up incarcerated. And so June 24th, 2009, all the way to January 5th, 2017, I remained incarcerated. I went from that county jail to another county jail that was a holding facility for the federal prisoners in Orange County, Virginia. And I stayed there for about 6 months in pre-trial and post-trial before I was finally transferred to a federal prison. And so then it was from the spring of 2010 to January 2017 that I lived in low security federal prisons. And those events and the time that I spent incarcerated, I hope to tell you all more about, because they were just so surprisingly impactful to my life. If I had known before how much good could actually come from being away from society for so long, I would have feared less, but I didn't know. And so, even while I was in county jail, I had made a promise to myself to take that time of my incarceration and use it for reflection and personal growth and development, and to try to learn about myself and how I could have allowed myself to move so far away from who I really, really was. Because just remembering now that emptiness that I felt, and the sorrow and the grief for that time of having thought that I had murdered somebody or taken part in the murder of somebody. Like I said, it was just such a emptying feeling. I felt absolutely gutted. It was as if the insides of myself was just full of ashes. And that I felt as if I wouldn't be allowed to be happy again. And I also felt that my actions were so contrary to goodness and life and God, that God would never love me again. And it took many years really for me to see that God had never turned their back on me, but rather that through my actions, I had turned my back on God. And so my time through prison was largely a process of self-healing, to relearn my connection to God and to feel that in a way that made sense to me. Because even before these events that led to my incarceration, I'd considered myself to be on a spiritual path, but it was a foolish path in the way that it was not rooted and grounded in solid principles. And it was was foolish because I thought that I could do evil things to eventually achieve positive outcomes. And that type of selfishness is a maybe it's a hallmark of humanity in a way, that we think that bad ends or bad means can justify good ends. And I learned so clearly and so potently and painfully that that's just not true. That we can't do harm to ensure our well-being, because they're just so diametrically opposed to each other. Even if it feels like it's a slow path to do good all the time, to achieve good, that's what our life is supposed to be about on this planet. About doing the right things, about taking care of one another, and truly recognizing that we are supported and appreciated by something that's greater than us, especially when we do the right things. And so that's a little bit about me and my start of the incarceration. And in the future, I'd like to tell you some more about how it began, the events, and the people and situations that really caused me to see the world wrongly. And, and in that time before, I sort of wondered if I was out of my mind. And in many ways I was, but what I really recognize now is not that I was out of my mind. In fact, I was entirely in my mind. And my mind was deciding what needed to be done. What I was out of was my heart and my spirit and my higher self. And because I was removed from that and out of my body in such a way and completely in my mind, is what allowed me to think that I could do things that were so against myself, nature, life, goodness, and love. But that's all I have for now, and I appreciate you listening to this. And I hope that you can take some understanding from it. Peace and blessings.